And it's a great pleasure to introduce Simon Rogers to you, who's he has three bosses really in his role in Idwal, which he'll talk more about. But he's been with the National Trust for 13 years, and the fee that I would give to a presenter I've donated it to the Snowdonia appeal, and so that's for practical conservation work that goes on in Snowdonia. So the fee's gone to a good cause in the Uplands. So that's, I think I'll let a few others who are joining in now. Just to let you know that in about 10 minutes into the presentation, we're going to do a poll on, it's using Mentimeter, if you're familiar with Mentimeter. So we've got a code for that, and then there's just three questions that we've got really to test the kind of on a barbed issue really, just to see your thoughts on an issue in the mountains, which is going to be part of the theme from Simon's presentation this evening. So I will field any questions that anyone's got. So if you use the chat function for that, please, that would be great. We'll have 5-10 minutes at the end for any questions. There was a question that came in last night, actually, Simon, about the impact of agri-environment schemes on biodiversity. I'm not sure if you were going to cover that anyway, but that was a question that came in last night. Okay, yeah, hopefully I'll cover a little bit of that. Great, I will hand over to Simon. Enjoy, and I'll introduce the Mentimeter in 10 minutes or so. Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Jim. Good evening, everybody. Noswaith dda pawb. And yeah, thank you for joining us this evening. Thanks for giving up your time to come and listen to us. Right, I think I'll start sharing my screen in a second. So here we go. So there we go. Can you all see that? Is that, Jim? Could you just confirm you can see that for me? That's great. Yeah. Yeah, brilliant. Okay. So Jim's asked me along today really to give a bit of a talk about managing Britain's uplands and kind of what goes on behind the scenes really, what we get up to in the various organisations that are involved in managing our mountains. And it's a big time for change at the moment. We've recently left the European Union, as you probably all know. And that's going to have a massive impact really on conservation and on agriculture and the funding that comes through that. So whoever sent that question in yesterday, then yeah, I will be talking about those sorts of things. So hopefully we'll be able to answer your question there. If you've got something more specific, there will be an opportunity for questions at the end. So first of all, I thought I'd just introduce myself. So my name is Simon Rogers, and as Jim mentioned, I've had 13 years experience with the National Trust as a ranger in Snowdonia. In fantastic 13 years. I'm quite lucky really, I absolutely love my job. Before that, I was a ranger. Even before that, I worked at a place called the Greenwood Centre, again in North Wales. So yeah, I spent all my life really engaging with people in the outdoors, kind of educating people about nature itself, but not just that, but about kind of the way we go about it and how we deliver conservation practically on the ground. And then my current role, I've been in for almost 2 years now. I've got the honour of being the partnership officer for Idwal National Nature Reserve, which is the first and, in my non-biased opinion, most important nature reserve in Wales. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Idwal. If not, then I'd encourage you to visit, and I'll talk a little bit about Idwal in my talk later on. Also, again, as Jim mentioned, the fee that Jim had offered to pay, well, that Jim would offer to pay for people who talk on these things. But I've decided, I didn't really want that myself. I'd much rather that goes towards conservation work. So thank you for everyone who's contributed today, and hopefully you'll be glad that your fee is going towards the Snowdonia appeal, which does some really worthwhile work in the uplands. Mostly footpath work, to be honest. So there's a lot of footpath work needs doing, tackling erosion and things like that. And the footpath work, a lot of people think it's purely for, you know, to make it easier for people to access the mountains, which, you know, that is part of it. But actually, footpath work is really, really fundamental to conservation. Like keeping people in, you know, the right places on the right track just helps reduce erosion across the area and can help protect a lot of fragile habitats and things, especially in the mountains. So yeah, really, really worthwhile cause. And thank you very, very much for contributing towards that. But yeah, today I'm going to be talking more about, as I mentioned, what's involved in managing our mountains, how we actually go about doing it, what goes on behind the scenes with rangers and wardens, people like that, what we get up to day to day, how land management is changing. As I mentioned, we've recently left the EU, and that's going to have a massive impact on the way we work, and certainly on funding. And I'm going to ask a few questions. Obviously, I don't have the answers for the future. Maybe I'm going to ask more questions than I'll be giving answers, really. But what does the future hold? Maybe we could just have a few ideas and look at a few projects that are exploring a way forwards. So managing our mountains is a huge honor. And a lot of people ask me, you know, when you meet somebody new for the first time, oh, so, you know, what's your name and all that? What do you do? I say, oh, yeah, I'm a ranger with the National Trust. And at the moment, I work at Idwal, so I work for the National Trust, National Park, and Natural Resources Wales. And the next question people ask me is, oh, right, oh, so what do you actually do? You know, a lot of people sort of know that rangers exist, but they don't really know exactly what goes on behind the scenes. So these are our kind of priorities, really, when we're kind of managing our uplands. We're obviously conserving and protecting nature. We want to work with local communities, various different people. So local communities could include farmers. There may be farmers who actually rent land from people like the National Trust, or we have neighbours who we have to have good relations with. We also try and work with community groups in the area, bring volunteers in, educate people about the work that we're doing and things like that. We also put quite a bit of effort into ensuring that people are able to visit sustainably without having a minimum impact on the land. We do what we can to preserve and celebrate culture, whether that's kind of language, names of places, especially in Wales. That's quite important. Maintaining and promoting the use of the original Welsh names, I think, is really important. And then tying all of that together really is education. And I think that's really, you know, a big bit of what we do is just educating the public, educating school children, working with universities, helping students do their research and things like that. Again, is a big part of our job. I'll just go through some of the kind of main things that we get up to day to day. So as I've already mentioned, in relation to the Snowdonia appeal, footpath maintenance is big in the mountains, really, really important to prevent erosion, really. You know, once people start walking over a footpath, you know, one person probably doesn't have too much impact, but once you have several thousand people or hundreds of thousands of people, as we have in Idwal, Ogwen area, and places like Snowdon and Brecon Beacons, you know, really, really big numbers of people, and that adds up, you know, that impact. So as people walk over grass, for example, they'll eventually start to kill the grass. There'll just be mud exposed, and then people tend to want to go around, so they don't want to walk through the mud, and the problem just grows and grows if you don't make any intervention. So we tend to pitch footpaths, and as I mentioned, people think that we do it to make it easier for people to access the countryside and the mountains, but that's not the principal reason. The principal reason is to prevent erosion and to facilitate our conservation efforts, really. But yeah, so it's not just about pitching the actual paths where we lay stones in the ground. We have to maintain the gates and stiles and things like that, which are on the boundaries, and you know, just general maintenance really of ditches and things like that. So that takes up a lot of our work. And we have a lot of support from volunteers, really. So in Snowdonia, we do regular pitching in days where there's an opportunity for people to join in and have a go and help our footpath team. We're doing them, we'll be holding them once a month throughout the year this year. And we'll be running those in partnership with the Snowdonia Society, who are a really good organisation who operate locally. So if you're interested in getting involved in that sort of thing at all, have a look at the Snowdonia Society website and join in one of our pitching in days this year. It's a great way to contribute, but also you'll learn loads from the staff, and the rangers will be with you on the day. I can really recommend that. A lot of our other work then involves kind of boundary maintenance, so our traditional dry stone walls and maintaining or erecting fences. And these sorts of things are really important when we're trying to manage livestock and keep animals in the right place at the right time of year, so we can manage the grazing, and it's crucial, that timing of the year, so you're able to sort of control things a little bit more and maybe keep grazing animals away from a certain area if you want some flowers to grow, for example. We also do a lot of work clearing invasive species. So there's a big project across Snowdonia at the moment to clear rhododendron, an EU-funded project actually, and the money's still coming, thankfully, at the moment. But yeah, clearing rhododendrons is a big thing. There's other invasives like Himalayan balsam and Japanese knotweed and things like that. Quite a bit of work and effort goes into that. We also do a lot of woodland work, tree planting and tree safety. Unfortunately, the countryside is awash with ash dieback at the moment, so we have to cut down a lot of ash trees for safety reasons, which is a huge loss. But we're trying our best to make up for some of those numbers by planting some trees. So there's the photo on the right here is an oak tree that I planted just before Christmas in the Ogwen Valley on one of the campsites there at Gwengor Visaf. And then another big part of our work really is monitoring of habitats and species. And monitoring consistently over a number of years is really quite important to see what changes are happening, to see whether or not we need to make any new interventions, or to see whether our interventions are a success or not. And it's this monitoring that's only going to become even more important in future, and even more important actually for farmers, because of the changes which are likely to come to agri-environment schemes. So I'll touch on that a little bit more later on. And then another big bit of my job is including people, so giving talks like I am this evening. So thanks again to Jim for the invite. Now we're going virtual. But you know, if it was up to me and if COVID didn't exist, then I'd be dragging you all up the mountain to show you the stuff, you know, in the flesh, really. There we go. But you know, so we do a lot with schools, school trips, universities, working with volunteer groups and things like that. And you know, a little story I often like to tell people is about how I got into this line of work. I was quite lucky as a school kid. I went on a school trip to Idwal, and I was completely blown away and inspired by the warden who showed us around then. And it was that moment, I remember it quite clearly. That's what inspired me to go ahead and do what I do now. So it's quite a special place for me, and it's a part of the job that's quite close to my heart, working with schools and volunteers, because I hope, you know, somebody previous managed to inspire me to do this, and I really hope that I can do the same thing for the next generation as well. And then another big bit of our job is working alongside farmers to manage livestock. So this is can be complicated. It's not easy, if I'm honest. We have to, you know, negotiate with farmers in some areas, find ways of working together, and come to certain agreements on things of keeping stock out of the field if we want to develop a wildflower meadow and things like that. So a fair bit of negotiation goes on with farmers about grazing, and this is quite critical to how habitats can how habitats respond. You know, grazing is absolutely critical to the condition of a lot of habitats. If they're overgrazed, they could be in a really bad condition. But you can, on the other end of the scale, it's possible to have undergrazing as well. So, you know, some people are maybe fans of the idea of rewilding. Rewilding means a lot of different things to different people, but Some people think it means just clearing farmers off the hills. And, you know, I'm strongly of the opinion that that would actually be a bit of a disaster, if I'm honest, because grazing animals are really quite important, and in the right place and at the right time, managing that grazing is, you know, absolutely key to maintaining some of our habitats. But while I'm touching on the topic of farming and things like that, I'll go into a bit more detail later on. But Jim mentioned at the beginning of this that we're going to have a little bit of a straw poll. So if I hand over to Jim, we're going to do a little poll just to test your opinion, get a feel for how our audience feel today on this barbed issue. So as a little poll, and we want to see what you think about barbed wire in the mountains, really. So Jim's just opening up the page now, and I'll hand over to Jim.
Thank you, Simon. So if you're familiar with using your phone or a second device to take part in these interactive polls, this one is Mentimeter, and if you type in on a web browser www.menti.com, it will prompt you to enter a code, and the code that we're using for this is just here, and it's 6119575. 6119575, and there's 3 statements or comments, really, questions, and so sliding scale: strongly disagree, or do you strongly agree? Barbed wire has no place in the countryside. Barbed wire is a valuable stock control measure. Barbed wire does more harm than good. So the code is at the top there. If you're still looking for the code, it's at the top of the screen. That's over a quarter of the audience. That's a third of the audience have that's 47, 49. So right in the middle.
That's really interesting.
It is interesting, and I guess that's part of the conversation and the presentation tonight is talking about these issues. So maybe at the end we might have more stronger views either way at the end of it. So that's 61. So it's around the middle, actually. So that's interesting. I'm going to stop this share, and I'll leave Simon. He can go back onto his share again, but we'll keep that live, and we'll have a look at the final answers.
Yeah, brilliant. So we'll come back to that again a little bit later on, and we'll talk about it in a bit more depth later, maybe. But interesting to see that was all kind of in the middle. You could say our audience are sitting on the fence. Okay, so let's carry on. So the habitats that we're looking at in our mountains, some of the things that we're trying to conserve and hopefully even maybe, you know, recover and expand and have a bit more of these, because we're in a bit of a biodiversity crisis, some of you may have heard, and you know, there is a big threat to many of our species and habitats. So I thought I'd just, you know, brush over these quite quickly. Each of these could have their own entire talk dedicated to them. In fact, I know Jim has spoken on some of these topics himself. But just quick broad brush things, some of our most important habitats that we have in the uplands. So we've got our Atlantic oak woodlands, which used to cover most of the western side of the British Isles, Wales, the west side of Scotland, the southwest, and Ireland as well. And these are our really, really old forests, you know, our Celtic rainforests, as some people like to call them, where the humidity levels are very high, rainfall levels are high. We have presence of epiphytes, which are plants that can grow on other plants. And our Atlantic oak woodlands are some of our most biodiverse habitats. They've got the broadest range of species, really, of some of our of most of our habitats. So they're really, really quite important. We also have lots of heathland in our mountains, and then we have different types of heath. We can have wet heath, dry heath, and montane heath, which is usually found right on the summits. And these heathlands in the UK, some people think, oh, well, we've got loads of it. But that's because the UK is very blessed. The UK has most of the heathland in Europe, really, because we're on that western fringe, and the conditions here are just right for it. So even though it may seem like we've got a lot of heathland, in an international context, it's really quite rare and very, very important. We also have blanket bog habitats, which are, full of various different species, particularly a very important species called sphagnum moss, which is absolutely critical in locking up carbon and as it turns into peat when it breaks down anaerobically. So a huge carbon sink in some of our blanket bogs. And then we've got lakes and rivers, our freshwater habitats, obviously very important for fish and birds and other invertebrates. And then some of our most special and rarest plants are found on our cliff ledge plant communities in places like Idwal, and kind of north facing, remote, inaccessible places which are away from grazing animals, is where you tend to find some of our rarest flowers, really, because they've just managed to cling on in these places. That's just a few of our habitats in the upland that are kind of maybe more our natural habitats as such. But then we have some other habitats which are really, really quite important. But these habitats have evolved alongside farming over thousands of years. And so this comes back to my point earlier, where if we just remove grazing altogether, then that might be a bad thing. We might lose some of our wildflower meadows if we weren't to manage them properly. And to manage those properly, you really need grazing. We might lose some of our acid grasslands, which are really important for waxcap fungi and other things like that. There are some really rare species that are associated with those kind of grasslands. And then in the Welsh uplands in particular, we have a particular thing called the Ffrwydd, which is a really, really special habitat. And the Ffrwydd is that area of land which is between the open mountain and the managed fields around the farm. And it's sort of a real mosaic of different habitats, maybe some wood pasture with some old hawthorn trees. You'll have a bit of scrub, some gorse, a bit of heather, a bit of acid grassland, and a whole mix, really. And those Ffrwydd habitats are really, really quite important because of that mosaic of different habitats on top of each other. And a lot of our Ffrwydd is down to the way it's been managed for farmland over many, many years. But bringing it back to the bigger picture and looking at the state of nature, how is nature doing? I mentioned earlier we're in a biodiversity crisis. And the State of Nature report, which the latest one came out in 2019, this is a report done by a whole group of conservation organisations led by the RSPB, but contributed, by the Wildlife Trust and the National Trust and Plant Life and various other conservation organisations. And they've discovered that, some really, really sad news, to be honest with you, but 15% of our species in the UK are under threat of extinction. They also found that 41% of British species studied have reduced their population since 1970. And we've already lost 133 species from the British Isles. And then, further to that, there's some other statistics there. Butterfly numbers are down 17%, moths are down 25%, and even the average amount of our mammals has fallen by 26%. And then, at the risk of being deaf by statistics, but I just thought I'd throw this other one in there because this one is quite key, really. This comes out of some other research. This wasn't from the State of Nature report, but Plant Life have reckoned that 97% of our wildflower meadows have been lost since the 1930s. And that is largely due to changes in agriculture, and the way that farmers use their livestock and manage the land. And that 97% loss is absolutely huge. And then the knock-on effect that then has on invertebrates, pollinators, birds, and other species is, I think that loss of meadows is largely what's contributed to these loss of butterflies and moths and other things, you know. And a lot of people think about meadows and they think of a beautiful sunny meadow down in the lowlands somewhere, but we do have upland meadows as well, which are different. And in Ogwen, we're doing quite a bit of work to try and manage those, to try and get a lot more variety back into the fields there, more flowers and more seeds available for a lot of the work we're doing is focused on a particular bird, a rare bird called the twite, which is a small little brown bird, which is very, very rare. And we're trying to work with our farmers to make sure that there's enough food source for the twite at that critical time of year, late summer for them, when there's not really enough food for them at the moment across the uplands. So where does this take us? You know, that's where we're at. But going forwards, it's clear things need to improve. So how do we do that? And I firmly believe that the key to managing our mountains in future is to find a real balance between what we need and what we want from the land. You need to consider that farming, nature, and recreation and visitors, you know, all of this is intertwined because we're all using the same land at the end of the day, and we all want something from that land. And as I've already mentioned, many of our most important habitats and species have evolved alongside farming practice over thousands and thousands of years. So if we want to find a balance, maybe first of all, we need to establish what do we actually want from our land. So it's a big question. What do we want? Well, we all need to eat. So our land is a great place to produce food. The mountains and uplands, quite marginal land, really, quite difficult to make a living. Most hill farms run at a loss, but that food supply is pretty important. The mountains are not really suitable for arable crops. So most upland farms tend to produce either, well, most of them in Wales tend to produce lamb, but other upland farms produce beef as well. It's generally meat that's produced in the uplands. But it is an important source of food, a place to produce food. It's not just about food, we also need water. Anyone who's ever been to the mountains probably knows most of our rain lands there. So it's a really important place to harvest water. You know, a lot of our reservoirs and things like that are based in mountainous areas. So that's got to be something that we consider when we're considering land management, is how do we manage our water sensibly and sustainably. We also need to provide a home for nature, of course. As I've just mentioned, huge declines in nature. So we need to make sure that nature's home is as good as it can be so we can facilitate that recovery. It's also a home for people. Our mountains, even in national park areas, are still home to thousands and thousands of people. If you go to national parks elsewhere in the world, very many countries, you know, no people live within the national park. National parks are true wilderness areas, but in the UK, it's very, very different. We have a lot of communities, a lot of people living in the national parks. In Snowdonia, for example, I think it's around you know, about 30,000 people, I think it is, live in the national park. So there's a lot of people there, and we need to consider any impacts on land management that you know, what impacts they will have on local people, whether they are people who are managing the land themselves or whether they're people who live in the village or just live next door. But we've got to consider the impacts on people, of course. And then we need to try and make sure that the place is accessible and you know, just open to people for recreation and for learning. You know, these things are so important for well-being, you know, your health and a chance to get outdoors, as we've all learned this year, and learn to appreciate even more, maybe. You know, it's absolutely vital for people's health, well-being, and moving forward. So I think anything we do in land management, you've got to consider opportunities for that and how that might impact on nature and things as well. And of course, we need a place for relaxation. It's not all about recreation and enjoyment and learning. Sometimes it's about just taking 5 minutes to just chill. And, you know, it's important that we consider that in the round as well. So how do we make sure that all these things come together into a coherent thing? You know, who gets to decide what actually happens on the land? it's quite complex, if I'm honest. It's not just down to who owns that bit of land. They don't always get full say in what happens, but usually the landowner has a fair bit of sway. The landowner may not be the person who occupies the land, of course. The land may be rented out to a tenant. And then the tenant would obviously have something to say about it. So they may be renting the land from a larger organization. Could be a council, a local authority, or someone like the National Trust. In which case, you need to have a conversation between both the landowner and the land occupier. There's also public land that's owned, by the public. Natural Resources Wales, Forestry Commission, these sorts of places, those sorts of organisations own huge tracts of land. Really, a lot of it for producing timber, and a lot of it used for amenity and recreation as well. That's public land. So obviously the public can have a say in that. You could write to your MP, you can contribute to consultations and things like that. So that's a way that people can get involved and have a say in what happens on land. Then, of course, major landowners, a lot of them are conservation charities. So National Trust, RSPB, Wildlife Trust, the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust, people like that. Those conservation charities, they generally own land because they want to improve things for nature. And it's these organizations, these charities do have they have a lot of sway on what happens, but funds can be limited. So they may have high ambitions, but not always able to achieve what we want to, because we need to balance the finances and balance the books as well. But with these charities, the way most of them work, a lot of them work on a membership system. So if you were to join a charity like the Woodland Trust or someone like that, maybe, then you have an opportunity to sway the way the organization goes. So by being a member of one of these organizations, then you could have a chance to say what happens on the land as well. And then obviously there's other landowners, Ministry of Defence, maybe water companies. I've mentioned common land here. Common land is a whole different kettle of fish altogether, because the landowner only has so much say as to what happens on common land. There'll be people who live locally, usually, who will have rights to use common land. So they may have rights to grazing on the land, or they may have other rights as well, maybe for collecting firewood or cutting peat or things like that. And a lot of these rights are shrined in law and go back for hundreds and hundreds of years. So that's often a complex web of conflicting interests to manage on common land. And then, of course, it's not just about who owns or works on the land. There are regulations and planning procedures that need to be followed in certain areas. So certain areas have extra protection. So national parks obviously have higher level protection for development. So the National Park Authority would have a big thing to say. And then organisations like Natural Resources Wales have a responsibility for triple SIs, sites of scientific interest, national nature reserves and places like that. And then county councils and local authorities might have something to say in areas of outstanding natural beauty. So it's just a quick overview there, very broad brush, but it's just to kind of paint a picture about how complex it is sometimes to maybe just get stuff done in the mountains, really, because you've got to include so many different people. And what affects the decisions of these organizations? So grants and funding, agri-environment schemes have a massive, massive impact on the way farmers choose to use their land and the way they manage their farming systems. The finance and the need to make a living, science and government policy can impact decisions, traditions, the way things have always been done. There may be some pressure from groups and organizations with a specific interest. And then sometimes there are regulations and statutory protections. So there are certain things you can or can't do. And then public opinion, sometimes people might decide not to do something, even if it's the right thing to do. Maybe sometimes people would sway away from it because of the controversy and it might not be a popular idea. And again, you need to consider all of these things in the round. And this is an infographic I thought I'd share. Just this is something that the National Trust use internally when making decisions about a piece of land. This is what we call our Land, Outdoors and Nature Wheel, and it's a summary of what the Trust hopes to get out of most of the land the Trust owns. Ticks all of these boxes to some extent. So some places might have a bit of a priority for being rich in wildlife over productive, for example. Or some areas may be a bit more towards the rich in culture, if there's some important archaeology and things like that. But in the round, the Trust kind of aim for all of these boxes to be ticked, really, and for there to try and find a balance. So that's how the National Trust would look at things. Natural Resources Wales have a slightly different but very similar complementary way of looking at it. They have these principles of sustainable management of natural resources. So I won't read through all of these. I'm sure you can have a quick look, but these are just sort of the basic principles that need to be considered in the round to make sure that any management decisions made are kind of, everything's considered, and at the heart of it is sustainability, really. And then from the point of view of somebody like the National Park, maybe, this is a screenshot from the Cynllun Eryri, which is the new plan that Snowdonia have launched recently, just highlighting some of their priorities there. So looking after its communities, they want Snowdonia to be rich in culture, have businesses that are growing a green economy, and have a great experience for visitors, and improve the well-being of Wales and the people who live here. So that's just a quick snapshot, really, of how these three organisations would approach it. And obviously, there are many, many other organisations. This is all, good intention. And in different places, every place has a different priority. So I'll just whiz through a few examples here. Hill farms, like you might see around Wales, Cumbria, Yorkshire Dales, their management priority is to make a living, produce food. National nature reserves, so where I work at Idwal, for example, the priority there is nature conservation and education and research. We've got upland commons like the Llanllechid Common above Bethesda, Abergwesin Common in mid Wales, the Lake District commons like Nether Wasdale and things like that. The priority there really depends, who you're looking at, but very often the priority is from the commoner's perspective. So grazing would be quite big there. And in the Lake District, that kind of the culture and the system of upland farming and the way upland commons used there has been protected by UNESCO, because it's been recognised as being of international importance for heritage. So it's a World Heritage Site now because of that. And then you've got areas of land which are peat bogs, as I mentioned earlier, really, really, really important for locking up carbon. So in some of these places now, the land management priority there is all about making sure that the peat bogs are functioning healthily, because peat bogs can actually lock up more carbon per square metre than a rainforest can. So by having healthy peat bogs, we can ensure that we mitigate, increases in carbon and the effects then on climate change and things like that. So somewhere like the Mignaint near Betws-y-Coed or Kinder Scout in the Peak District, that really is kind of, from a land management perspective, the top priority really is making sure that they're in good condition. But they could also be farmland. So the Mignaint is actually common land, a lot of it. So there is some grazing there, but perhaps that's not at the fore in some areas, Then in the Pennines especially, we have a lot of grouse moors, which are managed principally to boost numbers of birds for the shooting estates. And then in a similar vein, a lot of the Scottish Highlanders deer stalking estates. So the management priority there is to maximise the number of deer on the land in order to keep their clients happy, so they can go and shoot the stag. So that's absolutely their priority is the population of deer. So I'll just drill down a little bit into Cwm Idwal as an example here. It was Wales's first national nature reserve, designated in 1954. It's designated because of its important geology and its rare plant species that are surviving there, some really important Arctic alpine plants especially. And as I mentioned, our management priorities at Idwal are for nature conservation, education and research, and to manage the public access, because it's such a popular place. We try and mitigate the impact that people have and encourage people to come and enjoy. And grazing's been excluded here since the late 1990s, and grazing's been excluded because the nature conservation is our top priority here, because it's such an important site. Which leads me into talking about how land management has changed and how especially farming has changed. So some people might ask, being the person who works at Idwal, how am I qualified to talk about farming and grazing when I manage a site with no grazing? Well, I would say I'm at the maybe seeing it from the far end of one spectrum where there is no grazing. And in Idwal, I think that has been broadly a success. You know, a lot of the heathland is expanding. There is some slow natural regeneration of trees, and some of the saxifrages, the mossy saxifrage in particular, is doing quite well since grazing's been excluded. But this has come at a loss of farmland. And this is an example of a change in management, quite a drastic change in this case. And as I said, it's because the priority here is for nature conservation as a national nature reserve. How have things changed over the years? So let's look back a little bit. There's a nice photo here from the Ogwen Valley again. Some people farming there, cutting hay with scythes, very traditional way of farming, no machinery, hands-on. And this is how things were kind of, you know, up until World War II maybe, or the area between the two, the period between the two world wars. You know, before that it was very hands-on, mixed farming, and, you know, fairly sustainable in a way. A lot of trees had been cleared, you know, cut and burned to improve grazing and improve the area for farming. But that kind of mix, the having a hen dress system where people may have taken animals up to the mountain in the summer and then grazed them down in the lowlands in the winter, gave the mountains a rest, you know, over the winter period. But then things changed after the war with rationing. People were hungry, there wasn't enough food around. So the government brought in the Agriculture Act in 1947 and guaranteed prices for farmers. This boosts production massively. So farms started going industrial, and production, it was all about production. How much food can we produce to feed the country? That was the absolute priority at the time, was food production. And that's how it was for a number of years. And then we joined the EU in the mid-1970s. And in joining the EU, we had to join the Common Agricultural Policy. And this is a policy right across the EU, which was designed to try and kind of protect farmers, really. So there's a kind of scheme where there are tariffs charged for imports into the EU. That was to protect farmers within the EU from cheap prices outside. But also the Common Agricultural Policy had some schemes to try and boost production and to try and subsidize farming in a way. And in the 70s and 80s, there was a scheme called headage payments, where people were paid per head of animal which they had. So you could earn more money by having more animals. So the incentive there was to just have as many animals as you could possibly get, because that meant having more money. But what happened was there was overproduction. So there was too much stuff being produced, and you'd hear about these grain mountains and wine lakes, which were stored on the continent because of overproduction. And in our mountains, what happened generally, the overproduction led to overgrazing, and it led to a massive loss of habitat and some species, unfortunately. So it was realized that that's not sustainable and things needed to change. So things did change. And then in the early 90s, a new system came along where direct payments were given to farmers. And rather than paying based on the amount you produce, the level of payment is based on the area of land which you farm. And this is, broadly speaking, the same system that's still there now. There have been a few tweaks, and obviously we did leave the EU a couple of months ago, but we're in a transition stage, and the British government and the Welsh government, with farming anyway in Wales, have adopted the EU system for now, while we get our houses in order and figure out what's going to happen. So farmers would get their initial direct payment based on the area of land farmed, and they have to keep that land in agricultural condition. Now, one of the good things about this is it removed the incentive to overproduce. But one of the negative sides, from my opinion anyway, is that critical thing of saying keeping land in agricultural condition, and the definition of that was not allowing land to scrub over. So not allowing tree regeneration. Having more than about 50 trees per hectare on your land can result in you losing your direct payments, which for most upland farmers are the largest proportion of their income. So there's a massive financial incentive to not allow tree regeneration on your land, which I think is, personally, I think is a bit of a disaster. And then on top of that, there's an option then for farmers to sign up to extra schemes, so agri-environment schemes. So in Wales, our current agri-environment scheme is called Glastier. And if you sign up to one of these schemes, or the higher level stewardship, it's called in England, you can get more money, but you have to do some work for it. And then obviously along came Brexit. So all this is going to change. Now, so what is going to happen? So a very timely moment. The Welsh government has launched a consultation. They've had a couple of consultations previously, a few years ago, gathering ideas, and they're consulting further now, and they've got a white paper which is out at the moment. It was issued before Christmas, and they're asking for people to give responses by the 25th of March 2021. So if this is something that interests you, and if you've got the time to read it, I won't lie, it's a heavy read. It's not an easy one. You can't just skim over it. You've really got to get into it. But if it's something that interests you, I would really encourage you to engage with this and to reply to Welsh Government with your opinions by the 25th of March, because something maybe I should have mentioned earlier, but agri-environment payments like this could be an absolute game changer for the way nature is supported and managed. Because if you look at Wales again as an example, 80% of our land is upland and 80% of our land is farmland. So it doesn't take a genius to work out that nearly all of our land is upland farmland. So the way that that is managed and the way that's financed is going to have a huge impact on our habitats and nature. So basically, the top headlines, I've just picked out a couple of lines out of this white paper here, just to let you know what Welsh Government's proposing. Now, just as a quick note as well, the English government are looking at something very, very similar. So they're calling their schemes ELMS, Environmental Land Management Schemes. And then Scotland's looking a little bit different, actually. I think Scotland's going to retain an element of the area-based payments. But in Wales, this is what they're proposing to do. So they're proposing to replace the basic payment scheme and other EU agro-environment schemes with one single direct support scheme, which they're going to call, for now at least, the Sustainable Farming Scheme. So instead of having two things where farmers get their money based on the land for farming to support food production with an optional top up for agri-environment schemes, instead of that system, now they're going to put the two together. So if farmers want any support, if they want any funding, they have to go through this sustainable management scheme. And one of the main aims of the scheme, this quote here says, The scheme should reward farmers appropriately for the production of non-market goods. And this is quite critical, the non-market goods. I'll expand on this in a moment, which are improved soils, clean air, clean water, yada, yada. So they'll be rewarded appropriately for producing these goods at levels above those set by the regulations. So regulations would be the minimum standards expected, and then there'll be a reward then for farmers to go over and above those minimum standards. So how is this actually going to work in practice, and how is it any different from what happened before? So as I mentioned, there's going to be one single scheme instead of, multiple schemes. And this idea of rewarding farmers for non-market goods, some people summarize it as being public money for public goods, because this money is, where does the money come from? It's taxpayer funded, so it's taxpayer money, it's government money, it's public money. And these non-marketable goods, which were mentioned on the previous page, are basically, so when you look at a farm, at a piece of land in the whole, their product is food or meat in the uplands usually. So that's their product. And previously, this public money was subsidizing farmers to produce their product, and then with a top up to manage land in certain ways or make interventions to improve biodiversity or whatever. But looking forwards now, so that's their marketable good, is the product that they produce. But on their land, they also produce other things. So they produce things on the side, maybe byproducts, which come from the land. So things, for example, would be water. So water lands on the land, having rained, and then joins the rivers and then flows downstream. And many people will think, oh well, once it's left my land, it's not my problem really. But what happens on the land can really have a massive effect on maybe the quality of that water, or how much of that water enters the river systems, how quickly. So there may be ways of managing land which can keep more water on the land for a longer period, which can help mitigate flooding. So the idea of going forwards is to reward farmers who do these interventions and produce these public goods. So the farmers will get paid for producing clean water, producing clean air, having functional habitats, having lots of species. And how is this actually going to work? So some of the, let's look at the public goods first of all. So some of them might be clean water, water retention on the land, public access, allowing people onto your land, having footpaths, healthy soils, biodiversity, and carbon sequestration. But how is this actually going to work in practice? So some trials that have been conducted, and these may be adopted, maybe not. The trials are ongoing, so this isn't definite by any means, but this is a proposed mechanism. And this is, for me, this is something that's quite exciting, really, because this is flipping the system on its head. So the way things worked previously, if a land manager had opted for the extra payment for the agri-environment interventions, then they would get paid to do a specific job. You would get paid to put this fence up, or you'd get paid to keep your cattle out of that field for this number of weeks. And they were paid to do the job with the hope that the outcome would be the one that was desired. Now, this payment for outcome system is flipping that on the head. So it's trusting the land manager or farmer to produce the results, but you're allowing them to decide how to do it. So the payment would come if that desired outcome had come. So for example, a target may be, well, currently you've got 4 different species in this field, 4 different species of flowers being found in this field. Over the next 5 years, we would like you to increase that to 12 different species. And they'll be maybe given a target, and then it's up to the farmer then, left to their own devices, how they manage their system to achieve that target. And this is really interesting. This is the game changer, really, because we're not paying in the hope that something will happen, that public money will only go out if the result is really there. So it makes it more efficient, less wastage, and it also trusts the farmer, and the farmer has more of an incentive to learning about nature and understanding what it is they're trying to achieve themselves. Instead of just being told, do this job, they'll be told, we would like to see this, and can you make it happen? And so hopefully I think this will see a real culture change where people are trying to maybe learn more about the different plants and animals that are on their land. This system will be a lot less prescriptive, there will be a lot less bureaucracy, so it'll be a bit cheaper, it'll be more flexible and more efficient. So the early results are in, and if I'm honest, they are really quite exciting, really. And if this is something you're interested in, I'm aware that time's running on a little bit, but just have a look, just type it in Google, payments for outcomes, and there's a trial in the Yorkshire Dales looking at upland systems, and there's a trial in the Thean Peninsula looking at more lowland things. But really, really quite an interesting way forward, and perhaps this might be adopted, and this could be the new future. So let's bring it back into the poll, and I'll ask Jim to come back in. Jim, are you still listening? Are you able to open Minty for us again?
Yeah, I'm still here, Simon. That's great.
Thank you very much.
I think the results have stayed on the fence there.
There we go. Okay, that's really interesting. So people are on the fence. So barbed wire has no place in the countryside, is pretty much in the middle. Some people strongly disagreeing, some people agreeing. Some people see that it's a valuable stock control measure. I think slightly more people agree on that. And if I'm honest, I would be on a strongly agree there myself, I think, because I've seen how important it is to manage these grazing poles, grazing animals and things, making sure they're in the right place at the right time has a massive impact on the biodiversity. And then barbed wire does more harm than good. Smack bang in the middle of the fence there, yeah. So yeah, maybe it does cause some harm. It can prevent other animals from moving around. Some bird species like black grouse may be quite susceptible to fence strike. It's quite a problem in the uplands, especially where they have big high fences in Scotland for deer. A lot of black grouse fly into fences, unfortunately, and get hurt. So perhaps they do a lot of harm. But there we go. So I just did that just to get a feel of how people are really. But I'm going to maybe offer a vision for potentially a fence-free future, right? So this isn't going to happen overnight, I'll be honest, but it is something quite exciting. So there have been some trials recently, and there was a bit of a splash in the news earlier this year on a trial into no fence grazing. So how we can manage animals without fences. So there've been several trials all over the country. There's been some down in Dorset on the Studland Bay.
Simon, just thought I'd say it's 2 minutes. It's cool. 2 minutes to 7.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll try and wind up pretty quick now. But this is the one that's really exciting for me because it's been done in the uplands. It's been done on cattle, and they had GPS collars strapped around their necks. And basically, you can use an app on your mobile phone to draw the fence wherever you want it. And this GPS collar, if the cows walk near the fence, it plays a sound, a warning sound. And if they get a bit nearer, the warning sounds louder. And then if they cross the boundary, they get a small electric shock, which sounds a bit nasty, but actually they have a little bit of training at the beginning and they learn very, very, very quickly. And in the trials, they found that actually, after a while, none of the animals were getting shocks. They learned what that alarm meant. So it's quite a humane way of doing things. It's quite the cost may hopefully come down if this is adopted in future. What's really, really, really exciting about this is something where you could move the fence for a certain time of year. You don't need a physical fence there. It could be an invisible fence because it's virtual. And what's also really amazing, really, is that it gives so much power to a farmer who can manage their stock, see where their stock are sitting on their kitchen table. So it really kind of can could really help the farmer while also helping biodiversity, while also improving landscape and making access a lot better. So you don't need to climb over that fence anymore when you're on your way down the mountain. So is this the future? Maybe, hopefully. I'd like to see that anyway. So what does all this mean for the future of our mountains? Changes coming. Public money is likely to be paying for public goods in future rather than the products of farms, which the market should pay for, arguably. Hopefully, we'll see recovery of habitats, biodiversity, sustainable and high quality food production, maybe shorter supply chains and more local food, more integration between forestry and farming, maybe more trees on woodland, but also more more trees on farmland, also more grazing in woodland, because many of our woodlands are actually undergrazed. So actually a little blurring of the line between forestry and farming maybe. And then hopefully some investment in innovation like the GPS fences, and hopefully those kinds of things will result in improved access for recreation. And then last slide, very quickly, what can you do about it? So I often like to get people involved. So you can support conservation charities by joining or making donations, you can volunteer, you could teach yourself a bit more about nature, you could respond to the Welsh Government white paper mentioned earlier, or you could of course write to your assembly member or your member of parliament. But I think the most important thing, obviously not at the moment because we're not allowed, but once lockdown's lifted, get outdoors, get out there and enjoy yourself, inspire yourself again, and reignite that passion for the outdoors. Because at the end of the day, you know, I often bring it back to this, one of my favorite quotes by David Attenborough: no one will protect what they don't care about, but nobody will care about what they've never experienced. So just spend some time engaging with nature, teach yourself and teach other people about it. And that's me done. So diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much for listening. And I think we've got a bit of time for some questions.
Well, yeah, thank you, Simon. That's really interesting. I think the future is quite exciting, isn't it? Changes and opportunities there. Fine, it's great to have you for an hour to give us your insight into that and the perspective really from a land management point of view. So hopefully everyone found that very interesting. Simon, diolch yn fawr. Thank you again for coming this evening, and hopefully we'll see you again at some point. Diolch. Bye-bye now.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thanks for listening.